Everybody. Uh, Recording is in progress. This is wonderful. We know a lot of songs. I mean, that's just a fact. Our Shabbat morning service is 3 hours long, and it's just full of these really short, really singable melodies. And, you know, we sing these tunes one right after another, right off the top of our heads. We don't have any form of sheet music. We have the words in front of us because we're using our sitters, but we don't have any sheet music. We just sort of know these. We sing them every week without looking at a hymnal or anything. And that's kind of amazing. I just want everybody to pause for a minute and realize how cool that is. Like, we have our heads stuffed full of these melodies and we just sort of learned them. We kind of know them, like we know Mary Had a Little Lamb, or we know Yankee Doodle. And we just, when the time is right, we just pop out with these melodies and we don't realize how much, you know, where we learned them, where did they come from? They just sort of float in the air. And so what I want to do, I want to frame this lesson by asking 2 questions about these short little melodies. We're not going to get to every single one of them because there are, you know, there's so many in our BEKI services that we have. So I'm going to talk about them in a more general way with a framework of 2 questions. The first question is, are these folk songs? And the second question, which is sort of related to the first, is what is a folk song? So what is a folk song, and are these that? And in order to start that, I am going to introduce you to this fellow, Bela Bartok. You might be familiar with the name Bela Bartok. He was one, among many other things, he's one of the very first people that we would recognize as an ethnomusicologist. So this is one of the guys who sort of invented what it is that I do, although, you know, he died in 1945 and the word ethnomusicology didn't really come into common use until about 10 years later in 1955. So he was Hungarian, he was a composer, he was a music theorist. He was also really interested in Hungarian folk music. And in this little photograph, what you see is that he's traveled out to the Hungarian countryside, and he brought this giant gramophone right here in the middle of the picture. This woman here in the skirt is singing into the horn of a gramophone. And he would put this apparatus on a horse-drawn wagon and he'd haul it out into the deepest Hungarian countryside. And he was specifically looking for illiterate peasants to sing into this gramophone. A lot of the people who sang for him ended up being women because he was specifically looking for illiterate peasants. And he was looking for the most isolated, most illiterate peasant groups he could find. He was trying to collect Hungarian folk music, and he had very specific ideas about what counted as folk music. And a lot of his ideas, you know, they're very old, they're older than he is, but he really codified them. And they still influence how we think about the idea of folk music today. So we've now sort of seen Bartok at the piano composing, out in doing his field work, collecting music. And then what he's doing in this other picture is he's transcribing the music. So he takes the recordings home and he transcribes them. So we'll stop the share for now. Bartok's definition of folk music, he counted folk music only as that music that sprang from the people. Ideally, the poorest, most rural, most isolated people he could find, who would have had absolutely the minimum contact with any sort of art music or popular music or any sort of mediated music that was around in Hungary in the early 20th century. Bartok's ideal of a folk song was something that was ancient, that had absolutely no identifiable composer, and that had been passed down in oral tradition from parent to child, by which he basically meant from mother to child, over the course of centuries, and that was in Hungarian. And this, he said, was the purest expression of Hungarianness that you could find. So, I mean, it's a really restrictive definition of folk music, he had a point. He was trying to write the most Hungarian art music that he could, and he thought that by finding out what Hungarian folk music sounded like, he could extrapolate that into art music. But that was why he was looking for this really restrictive kind of folk music. And he sort of set the pattern for other ethnomusicologists, people like Frances Densmore, who went out and recorded Native Americans in her gramophone. Alan Lomax, you might have heard of him. He recorded folk song all over the world. He did a lot of recordings in Spain, and he also recorded some sacred harp singing. Tony Seeger is a wonderful man, tells the greatest stories at SEM, will tell you stories for ages about how he and his battery-operated tape recorder went down to the Amazon Valley in Brazil to record the music of the Suya people. And what ethnomusicologists like this do is they're operating sort of on Bartok's idea of folk music. You find these isolated rural people and you make them sing at you, and that is their folk music. That is the music of the people. So that's a really restrictive definition of folk music. And of course, we have other definitions of folk music. We'll take a look at them here. So you might recognize we have the Weavers and we have the Kingston Trio. There was a folk music revival in the 20th century that was, in the case of the Kingston Trio, kind of fun. In the case of the Weavers, it got very political. It was certainly mediated. These groups existed as much on recordings as they did in live performance. So this is already a kind of folk music that Bartok wouldn't recognize and wouldn't deal with. And then, of course, you have a definition of folk music from this man. This is a blues man called Big Bill Broomsey, who rather famously said, "All music is folk music. I ain't never heard a horse sing a song." So we have this sort of wide definition of what counts as a folk song. And we care about it. The reason that I've started out with this, the reason that I'm framing the question is that we care about what counts as a folk song, because folk music is one of the markers that we use to differentiate different people groups from each other. So for instance, Jewish music is part of what makes us the Jews. That makes us different from other Americans, or that makes the Jews a separate people from the Germans. We want to be identifiable by our music. And because we've lived in so many different settings, we place a lot of importance on synagogue music, because that's the music that's really ours. Like, nobody else around will go to the synagogue. If you say Jewish synagogue, it's kind of, you don't need to add Jewish to synagogue. And we want to believe, one of the things that we really want to believe about our synagogue music is that our songs, not necessarily the nusach, not the prayer formulas, but the songs, the composed melodies, are somehow folk music, because this means that they come from us, they come from the people, and they are an expression of who we are. We've all been kind of influenced by Bartok's understanding of folk music and the idea of folk art that he got from even older sources like Johann Gottfried Herder, who was an 18th century ethnologist who would travel around and look for folk culture as an expression of the people. So we want to think that our songs are folk music. And so are we correct about that? Well, we're now going to look at where a lot of these short melodies come from. And I just want you to keep in the back of your mind our two questions. Are these folk songs, and what is a folk song? So we've talked earlier about how we talked about Israel Goldfarb as the father of congregational song. And although we talk about that, the idea of a singing congregation didn't originate with Goldfarb. He was just very good at writing the music that would appeal to congregations. But the idea that congregations should sing these short melodies is actually tied up with the start of the conservative movement itself. You may know that the Jewish Theological Seminary was founded in the 1880s. I believe it was 1886. and it was founded as a modern Orthodox seminary. But by the early 20th century, they wanted to go in a new direction. And in 1902, they hired Rabbi Solomon Schechter, who's a British rabbi. He, in fact, came from Cambridge, so go Cantab. They hired Solomon Schechter to come from Cambridge to be the new head of JTS. And under his leadership, JTS really aligned and sort of developed the relationship with modernity that would make it ultimately the flagship of the conservative movement. And so we all know about Solomon Schechter. He got reincarnated as a string of Jewish day schools, but he did not come alone. He was married. And what the person that I want to focus on at the moment is his wife, Matilda Schechter. And we actually have a photograph of her. This is Matilda Schechter, who came with her husband, Solomon. She was also interested in how worship worked. She was really interested in music. She also co-founded the National Council of Jewish Women. So she was not sitting around. She knew that her husband was helping to reform the ideological basis of JTS, and she was very interested in how congregations worked. So she looked at Reform synagogues in New York in 1902, and she thought that the services were too calm and too decorous, that there was a choir, and there was a cantorial soloist, and that the congregation was sitting very properly and being sung at. Then every now and then they would pick up the Union hymnal and they would sing some undistinguished hymn setting. And she didn't like that. But she also looked at Orthodox synagogues, and she thought that they didn't have the right idea for worship either. She thought that they rushed through the liturgy. A lot of Orthodox synagogues, particularly old-fashioned ones, like if you've ever been to certain Chabad services, they'll just rattle through the liturgy really, 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 really fast because they have a lot of prayers and they want to get through them all. And so everybody kind of goes through very fast. And Matilda Schechter didn't like that. She thought that they weren't really appreciating the words that they were saying, that it was just a matter of pushing sounds out of your mouth as fast as you could. So this is sort of Goldilocks here. The Reform is too decorous. Orthodox is too rushed. She wants something that's just right. And so she and other people started to come up with the idea that congregations should be taught to sing, not chant very quickly and not listen to a choir, but should be taught to sing words so that they can keep in time with each other, so they can appreciate the prayers that they're singing and really engage with the music and be thoughtful and be mindful of worship. And she spread this idea. She talked to people, she talked to her husband. This sort of began the seed, the idea that congregations should sing. And this seed would grow over the next 60 years of life. So JTS was starting to think about congregational song as early as 1902 and 1903. It wasn't the only Jewish institution that was thinking about the idea of congregational song. There was another organization called Young Israel, and Young Israel is still around today. It's sort of Young Israel has evolved into a modern Orthodox organization, but it was founded in 1912. And it was founded as a movement that was essentially intended to prevent young Orthodox Jews from becoming Reform. They didn't like the Reform services either. They said, no, 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 just because you're in America doesn't mean that you have to go off and be Presbyterians. You know, you should stay Orthodox, but we need to keep you interested. So they decided to make services accessible. They decided to make them a bit more equitable, a little less hierarchical, and a lot more participatory. So they instituted lay leadership. They didn't really want a professional rabbi. They didn't want a professional chazan. And because of that, they needed congregational song, because if you don't have a professional chazan who can perform these beautiful ornamental improvisations on nusach, which takes some training, You need something simpler for congregations to sing, something that they can sing, but that also feels Jewish, that doesn't sound like a Presbyterian hymn. So Israel Goldfarb was really good at writing this type of music. And he actually wrote a lot of music for young Israel, including, as we learned 2 weeks ago, Shalom Aleichem, but he wasn't the only one. Young Israel appreciated a lot of other composers. And in particular, one of the composers that they really enjoyed, we're going to take a look at his picture here, was Chazan Zadel Rovner. Now, Zadel Rovner was not his birth name. His birth name was Jacob Samuel Maragowski. And the way that Jacob Maragowski became Zadel Rovner is that he was named after his grandfather, and his mother nicknamed him Zadel. She just nicknamed him Grandpappy, because mothers do that. And Rovner is interesting. He was born in Ukraine, and he bounced around through a lot of different cities. And at one point, he wound up in a Ukrainian city called Rovna, which is, Rivne in modern Ukraine. And he was their chazan for quite a while. And so Rovner, he was Zadel from Rovna, so Zadel Rovner, and that was sort of how he's entered history. He was a master composer. And he was also a master of adapting his music to whatever situation was at hand. I mean, you could throw anything at this guy. When he was about 16, the Hasidic Rebbe who told him, "You're going to be a great chazan," gave him 2 weeks notice and said, "I want you to daven slichus in my court." And 16-year-old Zadel Rovner said, "Okay." And he just sort of figured out how to do it. And then a number of years later, at one of his other synagogues, they said, "Hi, you have a choir." And he said, "I have no idea what to do with a choir, but I'm going to figure out what to do with a choir." And in fact, he became a really good choral composer and a really good choir conductor. So in 1914, he ended up in the United States, and he never really intended to stay, but he did stay until the end of his life. And he wrote a lot of choral music for Orthodox synagogues, and young Israel really liked some of that music. And exactly as happened with the choral music of Sulzer and Lewandowski that we heard last week, some of Rovner's choral music got adapted for congregational singing as well. So for instance, you may know Be Anarachetz Velishme Kadisha Kadisha Yakira Ana Emar Tushbechan. This is from the Torah service, and it's that whole paragraph. It's the last line of a paragraph from the Zohar, and Rovner had set that whole paragraph as a choral piece. And young Israel just sort of took that last little bit, and they adapted it as a choral melody, and they adapted it as a congregational melody, and they keep singing it. Nobody really sings Rovner's full choral arrangement anymore, but we sing that. And the first recording that I wanted you to hear, Rovner, you saw he was born in 1856. There are very, very few recordings of Rovner that is not somebody else singing Be'ana Rachetz. But there are a couple of recordings of his voice, and they're, 1914 quality recordings. But I did want you to hear just a recording of Rovner singing. So this is interesting. This is a Hineni that is a preparatory prayer for counting the Omer. So you can hear him leading a group of choir singers here. So there's just a little taste of, Ravner leading other men in singing. So young Israel, remember this young Israel is one who adapted Be'ana Rachetz. Young Israel was really good at kind of snurching melodies and not taking note of where they got them. They were all about this sort of communal participatory experience, and they weren't really into writing down where they got their melodies from. So we know about Shalom Aleichem because Goldfarb published it. And we know about Be'ana Rachetz because, again, Ravner wrote this choral arrangement that he published. Young Israel also snurched melodies from other chazanim that they'd heard. They adapted melodies from folk songs, from opera arias, from popular music. And a lot of these were arranged by a figure known in technical musicological terms as some dude, or possibly a committee of some dudes. There are a lot of melodies that we have, and there are a lot of melodies particularly used in the conservative movement that we can trace to young Israel. And we may not necessarily be able to trace where all of them come from, but at least we can say some dude at young Israel either composed or arranged these melodies. So one of them turns out to be a very popular Adon Olam that nobody has been able to figure out beyond young Israel where it came from. It might have been a folk melody at one point. It's one that kids like. It's the one that goes, Adon Olam, Asher Malach, B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra, Adon Olam, Li'et Nasa V'chetzol Kol, Azai Melech Shemo Nikra, Adon Olam. And people's heads are bouncing up and down. We all know this one. Abraham Binder, who was, he codified a lot of synagogue music. He wrote a lot down. He was a music teacher. He thought it sounded like a French nightclub song. He was not particularly fond of this piece of music, but people love it. Kids love it. It's one of these pieces of music that is really good at what it does, which is getting congregations engaged. Young Israel has also given us other famous tunes that we know. They've given us Naritzecha v'nakdishcha kesod siach sarfei kodesh. If you ever wondered why that particular bit of the Kedusha is just so singable, it's because it was designed to be that way. This was young Israel saying everybody should be able to participate in this melody. Another one that we use that you may be familiar with is one from the High Holy Days. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, Erech Apayim, V'Rav Chesed Ve'emet. We know this melody. This comes from the High Holy Days. This is another one that young Israel stole, adapted, composed, possibly all three, but was designed to be accessible, was designed to be melodic, was designed to be something that anyone could learn how to sing, and so anyone could participate in the service. So that's what young Israel did. They kept doing this for years and years and years. I want to move on to another figure in this story. One of the things that you'll notice is that there are three Jewish movements: the Orthodoxy, the Conservative, and the Reconstructionist movement, that are all in the early years of the 20th century trying to separate from each other. They were all born from each other, and they're all trying to figure out who they are and where they're going and how they differentiate from each other. And there's a lot of cross-pollination. There's a lot of people who are working for all three of these movements, plus the Reform movement. So this is not just a story of conservative music, it's a story of American music. So for a while, young Israel was working with Mordecai Kaplan. Mordecai Kaplan, you probably know him as the guy who founded the Reconstructionist movement. But at this point, he hasn't done that yet. He is a graduate of JTS. He and Israel Goldfarb actually both graduated from JTS in the same year in 1902. Kaplan was born Orthodox, and when he started at JTS, he started before Solomon Schechter arrived, so it was still very much a modern Orthodox school. But through his work with young Israel, Mordecai Kaplan was already starting to develop his conception of Judaism as a civilization that would eventually lead him to forming the Reconstructionist movement, but he wasn't quite there yet. But he did believe that congregational song represented the idea of community responsibility for worship. And so he was also into this idea. So in 1918, he founds the Jewish Center on 86th Street. It's one of the first synagogues to be called a Jewish center rather than a shul or a synagogue or a temple. This was a cultural center as well as a house of worship. And he essentially used it to test out a lot of his ideas. And he hired a cantor. Well, he hired a person who could be a cantor for the synagogue. We're going to meet him now. He hired this fellow, Jacob Bamel. Bamel was born near Minsk, so he was from Belarus, but he moved to Berlin in 1903 and studied at the Royal Academy of Art. So kind of like Lewandowski a little bit. So we can. The mustache is unfortunate. It was a very popular style of mustache. Nobody wears this mustache anymore for the same reason that little Jewish boys stopped being named Adolf in the middle of the 20th century. So Bamel served after he grew up, he served as a cantor at a number of synagogues in Berlin and Copenhagen. He sang a little bit. He was mostly a music director. He was a choir conductor, and he was, he'd gone to the Royal Academy of Art. He was really well trained in German classical music and in choir directing. And at the Jewish Center, where he was hired essentially to be the cantor, he put these skills to work, and his big thing was he got the congregation singing without the help of a choir. Matilda Schechter had wanted to keep choirs just in the capacity of leading a congregation in song. So you get essentially an amen corner of singers who know the song, and the congregation can follow them. Bamel was good enough that he got the congregation singing without having to follow a choir. So he was that good. He composed Vezot HaTorah, Vezot HaTorah, Asher Sam Moshe, L'fnei Bnei Yisrael Api Adonai, V'yad Moshe. So he composed that for the Jewish Center on 86th Street. Notice it sounds very upright and very German. He also, and this is something that has just been rediscovered, I would say in the past 10 years. He is the one who is responsible for this melody. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. One of the most famous short melodies. For years, you would see this either attributed to traditional or called the Sulzer melody. For years, people thought that Solomon Sulzer had composed it, but he didn't. My colleague, Judah Cohen, who works at Indiana University and who's written a book about American synagogue music in the 19th century, thinks that Alois Kaiser, who was the music director who helped put together the Union hymnal, essentially got some wires crossed and misattributed that melody to Sulzer, or possibly that Kaiser had composed a melody that kind of started similar and ended differently, but that it got attributed to Sulzer. And for years, people thought it was Sulzer's melody. And recently, Jeffrey Goldberg, another musicologist, has figured out that it was actually Jacob Bamel who wrote that piece of music. So Bamel, he did a lot. He didn't just work for conservative and Orthodox congregations. Remember I said that the Reform movement came back to this also. Bamel had been trained in Berlin. He'd been trained at a Berlin music school. And he was very good at writing the type of music that Reform synagogues in 1918 really liked. He has about 8 or 9 compositions in the Union hymnal. That's, this one, this is the 1943 edition. I've looked through them. They are unbelievably pedestrian and undistinguished, so I'm not going to bore you with them. They're dull. But he also composed organ music because Reform synagogues liked, if they could, they like to use organ. So what I'm going to play for you now is a little bit of an organ piece that he wrote called In Memoriam. And this is something that a high Reform synagogue in New York in 1920 might have used for Yizkor service. So the same guy who gave us the Shema and Vizot HaTorah also gave us this piece of music. You hear it? So unfortunately, we can't hear the whole thing, but you can imagine during a Yizkor service, an organist the organ might be in the back of the synagogue, the organist might play this piece of music, and everybody would be able to sit and very quietly think about the people that they'd lost. So the Jewish Center was founded in 1918. Both Kaplan and Bamel had left it by 1920. They went on to other things. Kaplan, when he left, he went to form the Society for the Advancement of Judaism. And in the 40s, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism was what would become the Reconstructionist movement. But in 1920, when Kaplan formed it, it was still conservative. And he needed a chazan for this new organization that he's founded. And he wanted Abraham Zvi Edelstein, who's sort of the father of Jewish musicology. He wanted Edelstein to be his music director, but Edelstein had already gotten another job. He was going to go off to teach music at the flagship campus of Hebrew Union College, which was in Cincinnati. So Edelstein wasn't able to do this, but in his place, he recommended a student that he'd had in Jerusalem, who was also coming to the United States. It's a fellow named Moshe Nathanson, and we can take a look at his picture here. This is Moshe Nathanson. Now he's going to return to our story, but here's a fun fact about Nathanson and Edelstein. They worked together when they were in Jerusalem and Nathanson was a little boy. They worked together to adapt a relatively slow and stately Hasidic nigun into the instantly recognizable party banger Hava Nagila. Edelstein adapted the music and sort of sped it up and regularized it a little bit. And Nathanson was actually the one who composed the lyrics. So if you think Hava Nagila is a banger, that's one of the guys that you have to thank for him. So he was a pretty good chazan. He wasn't special as a chazan, but he, like Bamel, was really good as a song leader. From all accounts, people just liked singing with him. And so they would sing with him. He was also a musicologist. He liked to study music. He collected and arranged congregational melodies. He was sort of doing for the Society for the Advancement for Judaism what some dude at Young Israel was doing. So last week, when we attempted to hear Sulzer's Torah service, I stopped it right before Sulzer's Av Harachamim because we don't actually use his Av Harachamim. The one that we use, Av Harachamim, Eitiv avirtzoncha et Zion. It's a very different melody. It's in a completely different mode. It's in the minor mode where Sulzer's Ein Kamocha is in major, has this very contemplative feeling. Sulzer's Ein Kamocha is essentially a trumpet saying, God is great. And then we have this very minor mode, very contemplative other melody. This one, that melody is Nathanson's arrangement of a melody by a Russian cantor named Abraham Dunayevsky. And unfortunately, I cannot find a photograph of Dunayevsky. So you're just going to have to imagine what a Russian cantor born in the middle of the 19th century looked like. I'm sure that we have no pictures in our heads at all of what this man could possibly have looked like. But that's where that comes from. And it is, in fact, a completely different melody from the Ein Kamocha that we use. So we've sort of sewn two melodies together. And so one of the interesting things that you can kind of see following along is that JTS has been in the background of a lot of this story. Young Israel organizes and arranges a lot of music. It does so under the advisement of two JTS graduates, Goldfarb and Kaplan, both class of 1902. Kaplan, again, JTS class of 1902, goes on to found both the Jewish Center and the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, both of which organizations also do a lot to compose or adapt and collect congregational melodies. JTS as an institution comes back in its own right when the Cantors Assembly, which is the Conservative Cantors Professional Association. The Cantors Assembly is founded in 1947, and that's about the same time that JTS's cantorial school opens. And if you graduate from this cantorial school, it's called the Miller School, the H.M. Miller School. Graduation and ordination from this school gets you an automatic membership in the Cantors Assembly. And during the late 40s and early 50s, the Cantors Assembly and JTS worked together in this sort of newly strengthened professional capacity to promote and support and codify congregational singing. So a Chazan, who was a member of the Cantors Assembly and also a liturgy professor at JTS, fellow named Max Wohlberg. We have a photograph of Max Wohlberg here. This is Max Wohlberg. He has an amazing talent for writing congregational music. So he's really studied Jewish liturgy. He knows what it ought to sound like. And he's very dedicated to the cause of making sure the congregations can sing it. Mechalkel chaim bechesed, mechayei meitim berachamim rabim, somech noflim verofei cholim, umatir asurim. That is a Wohlberg melody. That's a Wohlberg melody that he wrote for a children's songbook initially, published it, I believe, in 1947. So that's how old that melody is. We've been singing it as long as my mom's been alive. But he wrote it specifically for congregations, for young people to sing and then to grow up and pass on to their children. So a lot of these guys, Wohlberg and Bamel and Goldfarb, the ones that we've met, along with a number of other fairly well-known cantors like Gershom Afros, Adolf Kachko, a bunch of these other guys, they all met at a series of conferences on liturgical music that took place between 1943 and 1948. This was you can probably tell this in the span of this time, a lot happened in the world of Jewish music. A lot of the star European cantors who would be imported to the United States every year to lead services were murdered. So synagogue music kind of had to change a little bit. So at these conferences, they're trying to figure out what direction American Jewish liturgical music should take, particularly because the United States, following the war, was the largest single Jewish community left in the world and kind of had to take a leadership role. And what they did, among other things, was they decided that they wanted to publish an official songbook for the conservative movement. Wahlberg started out as the editor, and he decided around 1952 that this was too big a job for him, so he couldn't do it. So he passed the job off to Moshe Nathanson. And so 3 years later, in 1955, Moshe Nathanson was very pleased to announce the publication of Zamru Lo, which is a grand repository of congregational melodies. It's the Cantor's Assembly still publishes it. It's still being revised and updated and republished today. Cantors study this book. Synagogue educators learn melodies from this book. Synagogue educators teach melodies to children. The children then grow up and teach those melodies to their children. And we keep doing that. And this is how melodies become congregational melodies. This is what happens when you go into a children's service and somebody is with a guitar and is teaching 5-year-olds how to sing the Shema, or how to sing Mechalkel Chaim Bechesed, and all the kids learn how to sing this. And they learn by ear. They learn because their parents are singing this music. They learn because a teacher in Hebrew school is singing this music. They learn because that's when they go into, when they come into the sanctuary to say hi and to sit on mom and dad's lap. That's what people are singing. That's how people learn this music. And so we learn these melodies by ear, and we don't, unless we're in a class like this, we don't sit and we learn that young Israel wanted to prevent young Orthodox Jews from becoming Reformed, so they made services accessible. We don't learn all of that. We just learn these wonderful, eminently singable melodies. And so we're back at the questions that we started with at the beginning of the hour. We're back with these questions. Is this folk music? And what is folk music? You know, we think of them as folk songs, and we think of them as folk songs in Bartok's sense of the term. You know, we think of them as music that sprang up from the people. We don't really think very much about the fact that they were composed or that there was any real sense of intention behind them. Bartok wouldn't have considered these pieces folk music. They are not folk music in Bartok's sense of the word. They have composers, even if the composer is some dude at Young Israel. They have arrangers. You know, there are people who are adapting folk songs, who are adapting pre-existing pieces of choral music. There are people who are listening to what chazans sing and adapting these melodies for congregational use. They have a lot of institutional sponsorship. We have Young Israel. We have the Society for the Advancement of Judaism. We have the Jewish Theological Seminary. We have the Cantor's Assembly. There's institutional sponsorship behind these melodies. There's a lot of thought and consideration put into them, and which is exactly the opposite of what Bartok thought a folk song was. But we're not required to stick with Bartok's definition necessarily, because, like I said, Bartok's definition was really restrictive, and the real world that we as people actually live in, the real world uses folk song in a much broader sense. Different scholarly societies and music marketing companies and awards organizations and songbook publishers and all sorts of interesting parties, we still quibble over the definition of folk music. You know, if you're going to give out an award for best folk album, you kind of got to know what counts as a folk album. So people are still quibbling over what counts as folk music. Just about all of these organizations take a broader view of folk music than Bartok did. So over the course of many, many classes and talks, I've used the phrase the folk process. The term is attributed to Charles Seeger, who was the father of Pete Seeger and the uncle of Tony Seeger. The whole Seeger family is involved in music, some in folk music and ethnomusicology in some way. But the idea of the folk process has been around since Cecil Sharp realized in 1907, sort of wrote down this brilliant idea. People absorb music, people listen to music, they adapt it, they transmit the adapted form, they make parodies of it. If anybody on a playground has ever sung Jingle Bells, Batman Smells, Robin laid an egg, Batmobile lost a wheel, and Joker got away, it's a parody of a song, it's a kid's thing. This is something that people do. And in 1954, the International Folk Music Council published a revised definition of folk music. They wrote, "The term can be applied to music that has been evolved from rudimentary beginnings by a community uninfluenced by popular and art music." So that's the Bartók definition. And, write the International Folk Music Council, "It can likewise be applied to music which has originated with an individual composer and has subsequently been absorbed into the unwritten living tradition of a community." And that is exactly how these synagogue melodies work. We have pulled Sulzer and Lewandowski's choral melodies. We've pulled, we've had Israel Goldfarb write melodies specifically for young Israel. We've pulled Zadel Rovner's melodies. We've adapted and we've massaged other Chazen's melodies. We had Jacob Bamel, who's writing music. We have Max Wohlberg. We have all of these sources that were put together by Jewish institutions in the United States for this very specific purpose of teaching congregations how to sing. And then we mix them with nusach. So we alternate between singing nusach and singing our proprietary blend of these particular melodies that have been crafted and carefully selected for this purpose for us. And we mix it all together. We put it in a blender. We learn it by ear. And at this point, we have folk music. We have a living tradition. Our music is traditional. It is traditional folk music from the perspective of a living tradition. The thing about Bartók's definition, Bartók's idea of folk music is closed. You cannot add to that tradition. There is no way for new music to enter Bartók's tradition of folk music, but there's always new ways for new music to enter a living tradition, which is what we have. And this is going to become important because next week, we're going to be talking about this living tradition. People are working on it, adding to it, playing with it, noodling with it, arguing about it. And next week, we're going to bring living composers into the mix. Yes, living composers. So I actually have managed, because I didn't screw up the music too badly this time, I've managed to leave a little time for questions. Yay! Go me. So I think we have some questions.
So yeah, people use the raised hand signal from the bar at the bottom if you have a question or a comment. Julie, and then you can unmute.
So Rachel, when I think about like living music and modern tunes and adaptability, I think about Adon Olam, which I feel like can be sung to almost any tune. Do you know where that tradition came into being?
The tradition, you mean the tradition of singing Adon Olam to just about any tune you possibly can? The tradition, I think, came about in Europe, and it came about largely because it could. That people know, the thing about Adon Olam is it has a meter. It's in an Arabic meter whose name I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but it's a meter that's almost identical to a very popular and very common European meter called long meter. And its long meter is not only very common, it's infinitely massageable. And I think people realized that they could sing Adon Olam. They could sort of massage any tune into the words. And Adon Olam doesn't have a nusach. It doesn't have a mode that it needs to be sung in. It's a complete free agent. And you get this little moment at the end of the service where you can suddenly be individual and you can do something fun with it. So largely it happened because it could. So the fact that, you know, somebody can say, oh dear, Meatloaf died, let's sing a Don Olam to a Meatloaf song. That is an eminently traditional thing to do. That is one of the most, that's the old, one of the oldest and most long-standing Jewish musical traditions. There's a question in the chat from Margaret Hirsch. Didn't Wolberg also write the melody we used for the first paragraph of Birkat Hamazon? The story I heard is that one day Wolberg excitedly told Mordecai Kaplan that he composed a new melody for the Avot, the first paragraph of the Amida. We don't need another melody for the Avot, said Kaplan, squashing Wolberg's enthusiasm. What we need is a melody for the beginning of Birkat Hamazon. So Wolberg did that. Yes, I don't remember exactly. There are so many of these melodies, I cannot keep them all straight in my head. I'm fairly, that sounds reasonable to me. I can look that up and get back to you. And yes, iambic tetrameter is long meter. Long meter, iambic tetrameter is sort of, iams are da 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 da, adon olam. Tetrameters, there's 4 of them. Iambic tetrameter in English poetry is just called long meter. So yes. And I also have completely forgotten the Arabic and Persian word, but there is one. Shoshana, yes. You need to unmute.
You talked about how the tune for the Shema came into being. Before we had that tune, I mean, people had been saying the Shema and on Shabbat morning, presumably in a special way. Did they just chant it, or were there note? I mean, just mumbled it along like everything else?
I don't really know, just because that tune is so old and so ingrained into people's memory. I would imagine that in some synagogues it was just sort of mumbled along like everything else. I'm sure that there were some, excuse me, earlier tunes composed. I think that Sulzer actually did compose a melody for the Shema. It wasn't the one that we use. I think it was probably chanted in Nasach, the way a lot of this stuff was. But again, you get this melody that's so simple, so singable, it forces everybody to slow down and sing it together and really think about what the words mean. So, yeah.
Anybody else with questions or comments? Well, Rachel, thank you for another interesting evening. Lots to think about, lots to mull over. And just wanted to let people know, next Monday, again, 8 o'clock, we'll have the next class in this series. And next Wednesday is February 2nd, and we're having a schmooze called something like What's New in Westville. And we're having Lizzie Donius, who's the head of the Westville Village Renaissance Association, and Alicia Crutchfield McLean, the owner of the new place gathering spot called Bloom. And they're going to be talking about some of the new things that are happening in Westville, and what to look for and how to get involved, and it should be very interesting. So I don't know if anybody's been, I've stopped in at Bloom a couple of times. It's a lovely little store, and she really wants to
sort of
involve the community as much as possible. So this is a chance to get to know Alicia a little bit.
Is Bloom the little shop that's like on the corner of Edgewood and like yeah.
Have you been in there?
Very briefly, yeah.
Yeah, they're very friendly, and she really wants it to be like a gathering place. She's got a little cafe and a little place where you can sit and eat, and then she sells stuff. She has flowers, lots of things. So come out and support her next week. And I think that's it. It's great to see everyone. Yes.
I raised my little virtual hand, but it went back. I don't know what happened. The schmooze on February 5th. Can we remind people of that?
Yes. Bruce Oren, whose art is on display in the BEKI lobby, is going to be doing a schmooze on Shabbat after services in person, God willing, etc. And you know, and if you've seen his work, you know, it's provocative, it's interesting. There are a lot of different kinds of things. It's going to be really fascinating to hear him talk about his process. If you haven't seen the work, it's worth coming to see it and get a chance to hear what he has to say about it. He was a journalist. He was a newspaper person for many, many years, and art is his kind of second career. And his work is really fascinating. And
Actually, can I correct that? He was a photojournalist, so it's not his second.
Photojournalist, okay.
It actually is all one, but.
Right, so that does make a lot of sense. But he did print editing as well, I think. Oh, just photo stuff?
Some.
Okay, anyway.
But anyway.
Regardless, he's now a sculptor, photographer, painter, you know, come see it all.
Yeah.
Did Rachel say something?
Thanks.
Another. Oh, okay, yeah, just another thank you to Rachel for being so wonderful.
Yeah, it was really great. Thank you. I mean, there's so much to learn. It's amazing.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I
Great.
will see you guys next week, and we'll
Thank
meet
you.
our first living composers.
Woohoo!
All right.
All right, see you then.
Guys.
Bye-bye, everyone.